Welcome to What is Going for new thought from the edge of Each week on Times flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. Spirits in Spacesuits, Souls on Safari, and Setting God Free. These are just three intriguing book titles bearing the name of this week's guest. Had a mystic Christian great-grandmother, a druid grandfather who immersed him in the folklore and music of ancient Ireland, and an Irish Army Lieutenant Colonel seminary speaking instructor for his mentor. And you will not be surprised to hear that Father SeanOLaoire is a long way from being your average Roman Catholic priest. A poet, storyteller, scientist, researcher, wisdom keeper, and a licensed clinical psychologist in private practice with an MA and PhD in transpersonal psychology, Father SeanOLaoire joins me today to discuss some of the provocative topics addressed in his books, including who is God? What is truth? Was Jesus a Christian? Did Moses really exist? What was really behind the mandate of circumcision? And who the heck was Yahweh? Father SeanOLaoire, welcome.
Thanks a million.
You're not your average priest, are you?
I hope I can live up to that description.
What is it about you that makes you a rebel?
I think having a grandfather who was, he was an extraordinary man. He was a druid in many, many ways, but he was always standing up for the underdog. So he was a brilliant Irish step dancer. In fact, he had his own school of Irish step dancing. So my mother, from the time she was a little child, was step dancing. So she told me a story one time. He was in Cork City. He lived away outside. He lived near Blarney, the famous Blarney Castle. And they would go into town every Saturday to do their shopping. And there was one bus went in the morning, and then it went back in the evening. So there was an area called the Bus Áras in Cork, the place where all the buses came to. And they're coming home one day, and they come down to the Bus Áras, and there's an old man sitting on the ground, scratching on a fiddle, and he's got his cap in front of him, trying to collect a few pennies. And everybody, of course, is ignoring him. And the guy can't fiddle for nuts. He's terrible. But my grandfather was a great fiddle player, and my mother was a great step dancer. So he said to my mother, Peggy, start dancing. And she's like a 12-year-old girl. She's really, really embarrassed to be dancing in public in front of a guy, a beggar sitting on the ground with a cap in front of him. My grandfather took the fiddle and started fiddling, and Peg started dancing. And he collected more money that day than he probably did in a year before that. And my mother went into the bus with her head over her heel. So he was always a rebel. He was always looking out for the underdog. And my mother was the very, very same thing. So fast forward 30 or 40 years, and my mother is in Cork City. She's shopping one evening, and she's going down a side street, and there's a blind beggar outside a fish and chip shop. And he's singing, he's a balladeer. So he'll sing a ballad, and then he'll try to sell the sheets for a penny each. And he's singing his heart out, and people are coming in and out of the chipper. And at one stage, this big thug came and grabbed the man's his cap and ran off with the money. And my mother saw it, and she took off after him. All the way up Oliver Plunkett Street, and the guy would look back, he could see her, big bulk of a guy, 6'6", 250 pounds, and my mother's this little slip of a girl, and she keeps following him. And he threatens her, and she'll stop, and then he'll go on again, and she'll follow him. And finally he goes into a pub, and she waits outside the pub for 2 hours, and he comes back out with another guy, and they go off down the street, and she's following them. And they split up finally, and she follows the guy. And at some stage, she sees a Garda Síochána, an Irish policeman, and started screaming. And the cop ran over, and she says, this guy's after beating up a blind beggar. So they grab him, and the cop says to her, this guy's been arrested many, many times, but nobody will give evidence against him because they're afraid of him. She says, I'll give evidence. So he's frog marching the guy to the prison, and my mother's walking behind him, and she's kicking him in the tush every 5 or 6 yards in the backside. So I grew up in a family of standing up for the underprivileged and the marginalized. So that's where I got it.
So that's where you got it. Did you also get the step dancing as well?
I didn't. My grandfather was a step dancer, a musician, and a storyteller. I got the storytelling. My sister got the dancing, and my brother got the music. Yeah. So
Wow,
he divided it between us. Yeah.
I tell you what you got for your mum, though. I mean, she stood up to that guy. You stood up to the Catholic Church.
I did.
You did. Just tell us a little bit about that.
So I've been thrown out of more places than most people have gotten into, Sandie. I was thrown out of Kenya after 14 years working as a missionary in Kenya because of work I was doing on social justice. And so at one stage, the area I lived in, called the Bringo Desert, there was a very bad famine going on there. And I was bringing in food from the World Bank, of all places. I was getting 3 lorry loads of food every month. And I was distributing it to the 19 villages in my parish. And I found out that a local politician who was like an assistant minister in the government was using government troops to take the food from his own people, and he was selling it. So he and I clashed furiously at public meetings. And at one stage, the president of the country, who was from the last tribe I worked with, a guy called Daniel Toroy Ticharap Moy, was coming to address a big rally in the area. So I put on my white soutane and I got on to this meeting. And I got grabbed in by the special branch CID, chief of police, and dragged before the district commissioner. And I was given 48 hours to leave. And so it was like, probably the saddest day of my life was the 20th of May, 1986, when I left Kenya for the last time. So then I came, I lived for a year in London. I was studying hypnosis. Then I came to the States in 1987, and I was working within the Catholic Diocese of Nakuru. And after 8 years there, they threw me out because I was advocating for women priests in the Catholic Church, and I was talking about reincarnation, which I believe very strongly in, and have had several experiences. So I got thrown out of the Catholic Diocese of Nakuru, and then on the Feast of St. Francis, October the 4th, 2010, I got a 2-page letter in Latin from the Vatican telling me they no longer required myself, that I could no longer represent myself as a Catholic priest. I couldn't teach in any Catholic college, or not even a primary school. The only way I could exercise my priesthood was if I came across somebody who was dying and there was no other priest there to hear the confession and shrive them, I could then hear the confession and give them absolution. Apart from that, I was out.
So the Pope did a Donald Trump on you. You're fired.
I got fired.
I just love it. I love it. I read in a report about you that the local priests complained to the bishop that you were taking away their parishioners because you were such a good storyteller.
It's hard to be a good storyteller, Sandie. Yeah. So I got thrown out of the Diocese of San Jose, and then I had a friend who was the headmaster, the principal of a big Catholic school in the next diocese. And he'd been after me for a few years to work as a chaplain for the school. So I said, I tell you what I'll do. I'll work as a chaplain 1 day a week if you give me the school auditorium to say Mass on Sundays. So we agreed to that. So the first Sunday we went there were 500 people packed into the school auditorium, and we had drained the local parishes. The Catholics from other parishes were coming in. And that went on for about 6 or 7 months. And then somebody sent a complaint to the Archdiocese of San Francisco that this was happening, and he ordered the school principal to shut us down. He said people should be going to Mass in their own parishes, not in the school auditorium. So that got shut down as in. Yeah.
Well, what a great advertisement. What a great advertisement for you and for the church. Well, not so great for them. So you and Matthew Fox must be good friends then.
Yeah, I only met him once ever. I heard him speak once. I was very impressed by him. I love what he did. So Matt actually took refuge in the Episcopal Church. So they took him under their wings. I actually set up an organization of my own called Companions on the Journey, which is still going strong 27 years later. And so I'm a spiritual director for that group, and it's a non-denominational group. So we have people from all kinds of backgrounds: Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, Christian. And what I advocate is that people need to work on what I call their own personal cosmologies. You can't import it. But most of us are living driven by some kind of an internalized philosophy of life, which we have unconsciously acquired, and you put us in any situation and it will be unconsciously accessed. So we were given it by the churches, by the school system, by television, by politicians, by newspapers. So we're constantly being told what we're supposed to believe. And I say, all the great teachers have told us, you have to think for yourself. Socrates would say, the unexamined life is not worth living. And Gautama Siddhartha would call himself Buddha, which means I'm awake. And Jesus Christ would say, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he wouldn't go to sleep. So again and again, it's about coming awake, and figuring out, what do I believe? So I use this kind of example sometimes that there are three parts of philosophy which are really important here: epistemology, ontology, and cosmology. So epistemology is, how do we know what we know? So for instance, is it because we were told something? Is it because we had experiences for ourselves? Is it because we work stuff out on our own? How do you know what you know? How do you gather the data in? So that's epistemology. Then ontology is, how do you decide what's true among all the data which you're gathering? And then cosmology is, now that you've figured out what are the kind of the truths, how do you put it together inside a kind of a jigsaw? So I use this kind of weird example. And imagine you've just bought a big jigsaw puzzle, 5,000 pieces, and you bring it home and you rip off the cellophane and you open the box and you have a look. And then you go to work in the garden and your child comes in, a 5-year-old child, and he sees this and he scatters the pieces all over the house. There's some in the bathroom, some in the kitchen, some in the dining room. They're all over the place. And the dog has joined in the fun, and the dog has kind of taken out a cornflakes box and chewed it up, and there are hundreds of pieces of the cornflakes box scattered among the jigsaw puzzle pieces. And you come in and you see this mess. So first thing you have to do is you have to gather up all the pieces. That's epistemology. The second thing is you got to figure out which pieces belong to the jigsaw puzzle and which pieces belong to the cornflakes box. That's ontology. And then the third piece, once you've figured out what belongs to the jigsaw, now you got to create the jigsaw. And that's cosmology. And so I constantly tell people, go out there and find the pieces and then figure out for yourself, what are the true pieces? And when you find the true pieces, put them together and create the jigsaw puzzle. And the jigsaw puzzle will show you the face of God. That's exactly what the jigsaw puzzle is. And you can't borrow it from anybody else. You can listen to others, but you have to kind of figure it out on your own. How do you gather the information on which you decide to create your cosmology? And that's a lifelong process. And if you do it properly, it seems to me, it should do 4 things for you. The first thing is, if you have your own personal cosmology, it should make your soul sing because it's in resonance with your core being. Secondly, it should stretch you out of your comfort zone because it's going to wake you up to stuff, to the illusions under which you've been living. Thirdly, you've got to constantly update it. And fourthly, you have to kind of be part of a community that will kind of support you in your search for truth, but challenge you in your belief systems. And so that's the message I constantly tell people. Figure it out for yourself. I don't care what kind of a background you came from, but you're living under an illusion. All of us are living under an illusion. So there's this great passage in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, where Thomas says there are 6 stages to the journey. He says, those who seek should not stop searching until they find. Stage 2 is when they find. And when you find, you will be disturbed. And when you are disturbed, you will marvel. And when you marvel, you will reign. And when you reign, you will rest. So what's he talking about? He's saying most of us are living a cosmology, that we've been given by others. If you're serious about your spiritual journey, you have to go on the search. You have to begin the hero's journey. But when you find what you're looking for, you're going to be really distressed because it won't jive with what you've been told. And now the temptation is, let me go back to Mother Church. Let me go back and cling to her coattails, the kind of the serenity and the security of dogma. But if you have the courage to keep searching after that, then you're going to marvel because you're going to begin to see the world with totally different eyes. And when you marvel, you will rule because now you're the master of your own destiny. Nobody else is calling the shots for you. And when you're master of your own destiny, then you can rest because you've found who you really are. And now the journey of love is going to take you all the way back to source.
That's beautiful. And that you're absolutely right. And that, that's how I look back on my journey.
Brilliant.
Constantly searching and pushing things away that didn't feel right and embracing those that did until eventually it all comes together.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Mm.
And it shows in your work, Sandie. I mean, when you look at what you've achieved and what you're at, and you're pushing the envelope in all these areas. So you're demonstrating extraordinary courage and perspicacity and a vision, because you're seeing what most people aren't open to seeing yet. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you for saying that. Let's talk about these books. I love the titles. You know, you're great. I mean, you could have been a publisher, an editor. You know, the titles you come up with: Spirits in Spacesuits, a manual for everyday mystics. Tell us a little bit about that.
I came to the realization many, many years ago, and it's based on a statement of Tyler de Chardin. He said, we are not, human beings having occasional spiritual experiences. We're spirit beings having a human experience. And that felt really, really real to me. And then I have the practice of seeding my dreams before I go to sleep at night. I've been kind of collecting my dreams since about 1979. And so I'll ask a question, of my angel guardian or my higher self or my soul self, whatever word I want to give to it. So I'll pose a question before I go to sleep and then expect an answer. So when I was about to write my first book in English, I wanted a good title that would kind of encapsulate what I was about. And I woke up in the morning, and this phrase burned in my head. Call it Spirits in Spacesuits, a manual for everyday mystics, because we're all mystics. Mystics are not special people who live on mountaintops, and sit in zazen for their entire lives. Every one of us is a mystic. Every single one of us, we're sourced from God, and we volunteer to come down here. We choose to be here, and we choose to be here now. We volunteered for three-dimensional density. Only the bravest souls in the universe do that. So every one of us is an innate mystic, but we're born into a system of forgetting, because when we agree to incarnate into three-dimensionality, we accept, 4 huge limitations. And the first one is we trade our cosmic being for these tiny little spacesuits, 150-pound spacesuit in my case. And we trade a cosmic intelligence for this little 3-pound massive wetware that we carry between our ears. We call it brain. And then, since this brain is so small, it cannot grok the entire gestalt of our experience. So we have to break it up into bite-sized pieces and process them, sequentially, giving rise to the illusion of time. And then finally, we agree to have amnesia for who we are, why we've come, and where our home is, because the discovery is the adventure. If we had all the answers, there would be no adventure. The hero would never go into the dark forest, if she had all the answers already. And so there's these 4 limitations: our cosmic size, our cosmic intelligence, illusion of time, and then forgetting the amnesia for who we are. So we're extraordinary. All of us are mystics. So I say, everyday mystics. You look around you, everybody is a mystic, but we are mystics with amnesia. So the trick then is to wake up. So the first job is to wake myself up. The second job is to help others wake up. And the third job is to create, Christ consciousness in our cosmos. So that's the journey every single one of us have agreed to. So it's a question of, can I roll back the amnesia before I croak, before I shuffle off this mortal coil?
You followed that book up with another one with a great title, Souls on Safari, a guided tour of mystical wisdom. We are souls on safari, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting that typically, it kind of in the English-speaking world, when we hear safari, we think it's an exotic kind of trip to Africa, watching lights and and kind of big game. But in actual fact, in Swahili, the word safari just means a journey. Any journey is called a safari. So going to the grocery store for milk is a safari. And so a safari is any journey, but journeys look ordinary, but there is no such thing as an ordinary journey. Anytime you set out, with a purpose, you're on the journey of the soul. The soul is saying to you, Sandie, here's the situation in which you're going to kind of reveal your mystical nature to the world now. It's just saying hi to the person who's selling you the milk. It's waving at somebody in traffic whom you may or may not recognize, him, like giving them the right away. And so, in a sense, every single journey is a journey of mysticism. So indeed, it is a safari. You're going to meet the exotic animals of East Africa, as you go grocery shopping in Palo Alto, if you eyes to see what really is.
Yeah. And it's an infinite safari.
Absolutely
isn't
infinite safari. Absolutely infinite. Yeah.
it?
It has no beginning, it has no end. Yeah.
I think I have another clue as to why the Catholic Church kicked you out. I mean, if they were to embrace the way you explain things, far more people would still be going to church.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the things I say, Sandie, is that I think religion is the training wheels for spirituality. Now, religion is important in the sense that it helps to create community, and we all need community of various kinds. If it's doing its job properly, it's creating an altered state of consciousness. Really good liturgy should create an altered state of consciousness. And the Catholic Church got it really well at some stage with particularly the high masses, because great ritual and great liturgy, it should activate all of the senses in order to create an altered state of consciousness. So stuff like incense. So now you're affecting the olfactory part of us. You're looking at stained glass windows in the church. Now that's a visual impact. You're greeting people, so that's a tactile version. There's great music, so there's an auditory dimension to it. Holy Communion should be tasty. The wine is terrible, but it should be. So it should be a gustatory experience. So great liturgy actually should be activating the entire sensorium. And that's the best way of elevating into an altered state of consciousness, because ultimately the objective of all ritual, of all storytelling, of all art, of all music, of all dancing is to create an altered state of consciousness in which your soul is singing the symphony of the cosmos itself. And so religion should be able to do that first, and then let us go free, set us free. You go off to college, and college is mysticism. Now you're free to let go of the dogma that supported you and the training wheels that stopped you from falling over as a little child. And now you're pedaling on your own, and you're going where nobody has gone before, because you're a unique articulation of source.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to devote the rest of the show to this wonderful book that you wrote called Setting God Free, okay. Moving beyond the character that we've created in our own image. You created a courtroom scene to bring Yahweh to trial for crimes against humanity. I mean, this book is very irreverent, it's very amusing, and it's filled with solid research that does debunk a lot of the information presented as gospel in the Old Testament. What gave you the idea to use the courtroom?
I'm not the first one to do it. The book of Job did it, 2,600 years ago, where Job is really upset with God, and he calls him to task. And there's this back and forth between the two of them. Now, Job comes out at the wrong side of that debate. But there was actually an event in Auschwitz during when 6 million Jews were killed, where Elie Wiesel, as a young boy, and a group of Jewish lawyers held a trial and put God on trial for abandoning his people. Now, I think the difference between the book I've written and Job is just a kind of advocating for himself, and taking God to task for his treatment of Job. In Auschwitz, they were taking God to task for his treatment of the Jewish people, the chosen people. I'm taking God to task for his abandonment of humanity, or what appears to be, God's abandonment of humanity. And of course, in the course of the book, I had Bible scholars and archaeologists and psychologists and legal experts on both sides, prosecution and defense, putting God on trial. And the ultimate realization was that this God is actually a projection of our own shadow material as individuals and as particular cultures. But I wanted to walk people through the scriptures themselves, showing that this is evidence coming from allegedly God's own mouth. So I'm putting the God of the scriptures on trial, because of the God of the scriptures is mythology. And once we understand what mythology is about, it has a very powerful message. I was lucky enough to be raised bilingually in Gaelic and in English, and then to learn 4 African languages and their mythology. And what the conclusion I've come to is that mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture. And in some cultures, they do it in a kind of a literary form. They have books. Other cultures, it's just storytelling, or it's proverbs of various kinds. And so I remember this as a young man, when I was still in high school, spending an entire summer vacation in a little village in West Cork called OLaoire, in which Gaelic is still the spoken mother tongue. And I was collecting proverbs, and in Gaelic we call them SeanOLaoire, which means ancient words. And I would go around to all the elders in the village, ask them, give me a proverb and tell me in what context you might use it. But I remember, so I collected about 432 proverbs during that summer. But I remember one old man saying to me, he said, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the proverbs. He's absolutely right. And when I went to Africa as a missionary, you know, and I learned the mythology of 4 different tribes, I would say to the people, if Christianity had never come to Africa, you guys could live according to your proverbs. Because the mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture, and proverbs are the distillation, the one-liner distillation of this great teaching. And so I put the Bible, I put the Bhagavad Gita, I put the kind of the Pitakas of Buddhism, I put the Quran into this category of mythology. There are stories that our ancestors told to try to make sense of where they've come from, to allow them to survive present vicissitude and to have hope for a future which is better than the present. And so they make up these stories to support each other. And from that point of view, they're really, really important. We always have to be the good guys. In every mythology, we're the good guys and our enemies are the bad guys. So you have to create an enemy force in order to feel good about yourself. So once you understand that it is mythology, then you begin to see the kind of the meaning, the deeper meaning of what it is to be kind of stuck in the vicissitude of incarnation, you know, in a particular culture, in a particular family system, and still kind of make sense of it and survive, you know, the tragedies of family life and cultural life and global life.
Is there a difference between God and Yahweh? I mean, some people say there are 2 gods in the Bible. Yeah. There's Jesus is God, you know, right, compassionate Father, and we have the very punitive and dictatorial Yahweh.
Absolutely. Huge.
Both are myths.
Yeah, huge difference. So, in fact, the word Yahweh, there's no etymological origin. They can't figure out. It's not a Hebrew word. It doesn't come from any of the Semitic languages. They cannot figure out that in Hebrew it's called the tetragrammaton. The four letters Yud He Vav He. But there is no way. We don't know how to pronounce it. And when you look at the Semitic languages, there's no etymological basis for this word. So it's a made-up kind of a clue in some way. Now, the God, you know, when we talk about God, there are 4 things that I don't believe about God. The first thing, I do not believe that God is a person. I don't believe that there's, you know, a dude sitting in the sky with a long gray beard called God. So God is not a person. But I can only have a personal relationship with God or source. I live in the middle of the forest. You know, my nearest neighbor is half a mile away. You know, I'm surrounded by wildlife. I spend a lot of my time just trekking. You know, there's a creek here, forest. I spend a lot of time. I've been living here now for 29 years. I have a personal relationship with the forest, but the forest is not a person. But because I'm a person, the only kind of relationship I can have with the forest is as a person. So God is not a person, but the only relationship we can have with God is a personal relationship. I don't think God is a creator. God doesn't go into his workshop on a Monday morning and say, today I'm going to, I'm going to create elephants. And then tomorrow he says, today I'm going to create mosquitoes. So I don't believe that's how it works, that rather everything that exists is an emanation from source. So I had this powerful vision just last year. I always had a very bad fever, and every time I get a fever, I get these powerful visions. I got it in Kenya every single year from malaria. I'd have malaria, and then I'd have these fevers, and then I'd have these visions. But in this vision, I could see, you know, source or God, whatever you want to call her. There's source. Source is lonely in a sense, because if God is all that exists, then no experiences are possible. If there's nothing with which to relate, you can't generate experiences. So the only way in which God could generate experiences was through what's called, you know, in Hebrew, netzotzim, self-fracturing into kind of bits of self. So I call these, you know, holographic fractals of source. Now, a hologram is an entity that contains the totality of itself in every one of its component parts. And a fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. So I had this vision in which there is God, and God decides, to self-fracture in order to be able to generate experiences. Because our function is like, we're like bees leaving the hive to generate experiences for the queen bee and bring back pollens that will be converted into honey. That's the function of incarnation. And so God generates these nets, so it seems, billions of souls in order to generate experiences for herself. And then at some stage, I call it the first conference, where God invites us to be co-creators together. And God says, let's do something fantastic, you and I. So we all get together with God and we decide to create a cosmos. So the cosmos is co-created. It's created by God as source and by the Netzotzim as kind of, holographic fractals as source. And so we're witnessing this extraordinary cosmos, all of the various creatures in this cosmos. So we're like what Buddhism would call Turiya, witnessing consciousness, the awareness of being to observe all that is. And at some stage, God says, I want to call a second conference. Let's get together. Is there something even more exciting we can do rather than be observers of this cosmos which we've co-created? And the decision was, yes, let's create avatars so we can insert ourselves into the cosmos and experience it from the inside out as creatures, as bunny rabbits, as oak trees, as human beings, as angelic beings, or whatever. And so we co-created a level of the cosmos in which we could be avatars, and experiencers. And Buddhism will call this Turiyatita, the ability to both observe but not identify with, and at the same time to participate in. It's what cultural anthropology will call the participant observer. The realization that you can't go into a jungle, in the Amazon, with a notepad and watch what the natives are doing. The very fact that you're there influences their behavior. And so you have to be a participant observer. And so here we are then that, we are co-creators with God of a cosmos, and co-creators of our own participation in this cosmos. So God then for me is not somebody who just created something ex nihilo, on the Monday and something else on the Tuesday. That God, is everything that exists is an emanation of source, which was co-created, by the first wave of this emanation. And so God for me then is not a creator. God is not a judge. God is not partisan in any way. God has no chosen people, and God has no special religion. So when Roman Catholicism says extra ecclesiam nulla est salus, I don't believe it. Extra ecclesiam nulla est salus. Outside the Catholic Church, there is no redemption. I don't believe that for a moment. There's no chosen religion. There's no chosen scripture. There's no chosen people. Everything around us, every rock in the river that I sit on, is an articulation of the divine. Every spider building a web, is a divine dance, in this incarnation. So there is nothing which is not of God. There is nothing which does not speak to us of God. And to pretend that God only speaks in one language and just made a revelation to one particular group of people, and you can only be saved through one particular avenue, that's total mishigas as far as I'm concerned. So there's no way I can get behind that anymore.
And so we are not creatures that are in school to learn how to improve ourselves so that we can come before God.
There is no way we can be separated from God. You can no more be separated from God than a ray of sunlight can be separated from the sun. I can put up an umbrella and not feel the effect of it anymore, but the sun is still shining. God is love. There is nothing, I talk sometimes about the 5 L's, that ultimately there is only love. But love births twins. I call them light and logos. So we know from quantum mechanics that all matter is frozen light, literally frozen light. If you could take the light hidden in one human body, you could light up a baseball stadium at 1 million watts for 3.5 hours. That's how much light a single human body contains. So all matter is frozen light. So that's the second L, light. The third L is logos. Logos is the Greek word, is a kind of a morphological agent, that which brings kind of a form to matter. If you imagine a potter with a lump of clay, the matter is the clay, but there's the genius of the potter that creates a cup or a bowl out of it. And so the logos is the morphological agent that creates form out of matter. And then these two dance together. form and matter, light and logos dance together, and they create life. And so life is the offspring, of what happens when you get light and logos dancing together. And the entire objective of life is to learn how to laugh, to wake up to the realization that we're living in Maya, to realize, that there is nothing except love that birthed light and logos that gave life, whose objective was to learn how to laugh. And so for me, when I think about God, that's what I think. Love is the ultimate source. God is love. There is no way anything could be permanently separated from source. We can put up our umbrellas of our cosmologies. We can put up the umbrellas of our fundamentalist thinking. We can put up the umbrellas of cultural divides. But ultimately, you take that, artificial thing away, and there is God, and there is love.
That is the best description I've ever heard of who we are. And we're going to take a short break now. And when we come back, I want to ask you about some of these questions from your book. Some of the ones that I mentioned at the beginning. So you're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is poet, storyteller, scientist, wisdom keeper, and clinical psychologist, Father SeanOLaoire. And we're talking about the revelations shared in his books. And after the break, we will be talking more about setting God free, moving beyond the caricature we've created in our own image. We'll be back with more from Father SeanOLaoire after this break.
Times TV.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of Times flagship radio show What Is Going On, and as an author, editor and 13 times book judge who's read thousands of books and interviewed hundreds of authors, I'm constantly asked what's really worth reading and what's not. So I created the No BS Spiritual Book Club to help you save time and money by picking the brains of discerning names who've walked this path before you. There's no catch, no fees and no BS, just an ever-growing library of 10 best spiritual book lists from some of your favourite authors and teachers, plus free book excerpts, audios and video interviews with people like Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., David G., Lee Harris, Mark Nepo and more. From well-known classics to hidden gems you've never heard of, it's the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to enlighten your journey of self-discovery. So why not join the club? Get inspired and save money at the nobsspiritualbookclub.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene Keys is basically the code book of life. In the Gene Keys, the book is made up of these 3 levels: shadows, gifts, and cities. And the journey is through those 3 levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the city. And the cities are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back, Father SeanOLaoire. Let's debunk some of those myths that are debated in the courtroom in Setting God Free. So, Exodus, Noah's Ark, slaughter of Egyptians, Moses, by applying mathematical and scientific calculations, none of these work out.
No. So here's the story behind it. Every people are going to try to create a mythology that allows it to understand where do we come from. So in Africa, we have the house stories and the why stories. And so every group, every culture was trying to figure out where do we originally come from. And we imagine even where do we come from as a species, let alone as a particular culture. The second thing is, we're in a particular situation right now, every culture is, how do we survive the vicissitude, or how do we optimize the opportunities for the moment? And the next part is, how do we prepare for the future? So a great mythology should explain the past, kind of energize us to deal with the present and give us a vision for the future. And that's what all the great mythologies of the world do, including the alleged revelation experiences. So the Hebrew scriptures, as we read them now, they're coming from two different periods of Jewish history. So David conquered Jerusalem in the year 1010 BC, before the Common Era. And he united 12 kind of warring tribes. They were probably nomadic pastoralists. They hadn't come from Egypt. They were Canaanite groups, actually. And we know from the archaeological evidence that the only difference between this particular group of tribes and the surrounding other Canaanites was the absence of pig bones, in their fireplaces. Everything else, the pottery, everything else was identical. So they're actually Canaanite tribes who've amalgamated together about the year 1010 BC under King David. And he establishes his throne in Jerusalem. He captures Jerusalem in 1010 BCE, and he rules for about 40 years. Then he's succeeded by his son Solomon. Solomon died in the year 933 BCE, but when he died, the kingdom fractured, and there was the 10 northern tribes seceded, and the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, were around Jerusalem. And there's an ongoing civil war between the two groups for a period. Then in the year 722 BCE, the great Assyrian Empire came in and it conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and it deported 10 tribes who were never heard of again. They're called the Lost Tribes of Israel. The 2 southern tribes survived for another 130 years. And then the Babylonian Empire overcame the Assyrian Empire, and it came in and it conquered Jerusalem in 598 BCE. And it installed a puppet king and then left. But the puppet king rebelled. So the Babylonians came back in 589 BCE. They gouged out his eyes. They killed his kids right in front of him, and they destroyed the first temple, the one that Solomon had built about 950 BC. Now, at this stage, the last 2 tribes are taken into exile in Babylon, and they're there for about 50 years before another empire, the Persian Empire, overcomes the Babylonians and sets the exiles free to go back into the land of Israel. And they now build the second temple, which they begin building about 515 BC. Now, in the period of exile particularly, they realize we don't want to go the way that the 10 tribes in the north went. We need to create some kind of a cohesion among us. So at this stage, they start kind of putting down all of the stories, the mythology of the past, all these stories of their origin stories and their survival stories and whatever. And they put together a bunch of rules. So for instance, it's at this stage that they begin circumcising their kids, the boys, to separate them from the surrounding tribes. So they're physiologically different. At this stage, they create the notion of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was not created by Moses in 1250 BCE. The Sabbath came at this stage to separate the holy day of the week from the ordinary days of the week. They separated at this stage treif from kosher. Treif is unclean food, and kosher is clean food. They separate the foods. They separate what's called table fellowship. You can't eat meals with non-Jews. And so in every way, they're trying to maintain their cohesion by creating this bunch of laws. So that's when the laws come from, about 550 BCE. They'll be attributed to Moses, who lived allegedly 700 years before that. And now they're going to amalgamate all the traditions, the stories that came from the north, the 10 northern tribes, and the stories from the 2 southern tribes, and then they'll create, they'll put all of these together. And the great scholars have been able to differentiate 4 different, actually, literary streams here. They're called J, E, P, and D. J stands for Yahwist, because the scholars were German, and so the J and Y in German are identical. So these are stories in which God allegedly is called Yahweh, that the question you asked earlier. So that's the Yahwist tradition. Then the E is the Elohistic tradition, because the word that's used for God mainly in the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, is Elohim. Elohim is actually a plural, and it means the powerful ones. It does not mean God in the sense of some kind of a divine oligarch. It's a group of organizers, a group of colonizers in some sense who came to Earth. You could call them ETs or space people or whatever you want to call them. So they're called Elohim. That's the second tradition of stories. The third one is called the Deuteronomic. And this was a bunch of material that was put together and ascribed to Moses. But it was written 700 years after Moses put out of existence. And then the final one was P, the priestly tradition, which was written in Babylon by the priests to hold the people together. So you got 4 very, very distinct strands of literature in the Bible. Now, at some stage, they're amalgamated while they're still in Babylon to try to bring cohesion. But it was very, very badly edited. So in many cases, you get totally contradictory stories about the same events side by side with each other. So even the story of the flood, there are 3 different accounts of the flood juxtaposed side by side, because they were amalgamated, but they weren't edited very, very well. And you appreciate this, Sandie, an editor. How do you make stuff rhyme? Disparate sources, how do you get it to flow? They didn't do a very, very good job of it. They come back to the land of Israel in 539 BCE, and now they're trying to build from scratch again. And they're enshrining this tradition as kind of the thing that's going to hold them together for the future. So in that sense, it's really powerful. You look now 2,500 years later, and this extraordinary people that have been subjected to more harassment and persecution than any other tribe in the history of the planet. And they're still holding themselves together. And what's holding them together is this extraordinary mythology. Now, whether there's any kind of real truth in it, in the sense of being kind of ontologically true, that's irrelevant. The fact that it became a mantra, an extended mantra that held these people together and gave them the courage to face all these persecutions and still survive as a people, that's the job of mythology. And you look at any peoples who've survived persecution, what holds them together? Their mythology. It's not political leaders, it's not an agenda of any kind. It's the stories that grandmothers and grandfathers are telling their grandkids about the good old days.
Yeah. Makes so much sense. So when and where was reincarnation removed from Christian doctrine?
So it's very interesting that the vast bulk of the spiritual traditions of the world all believe in reincarnation, because they're great nature observers. And you look at nature is constantly reincarnating itself. The trees that dropped off your tree in autumn are suddenly going to appear again in spring. So everything regenerates in a cyclical format. So all the great spiritual traditions realize that reincarnation or remanifestation is how the system works. Now you can find it in Judaism and in the kind of mystical Judaism, very strong belief in it. You find it in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Celtic mythology. You find it in all these traditions, and you find it in the New Testament. There's 2 great stories in the New Testament. There's one in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, where Jesus, a week before he dies, takes Peter and James and John, and they go up into the top of Mount Tabor. And he has this extraordinary experience where he has a shift in consciousness, which is so profound that he's having an encounter with Moses and Elijah. Now, Moses, the putative figure, the mythological figure, would have lived, 1250 BCE, 1250 years before Jesus. Elijah would have lived 750 years before Jesus. But Moses represents the kind of the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. And these are the 2 great legs of Jewish mythology, the law and the prophets. So Christ is having an encounter with the law and the prophets, because he's going to bring them together and conclude it in some way. And his experience is so profound that the other 3 guys can see it as well. It's a kind of a participatory mystical experience. And so he's coming down the mountain at the end of it, and the disciples say to him, why do the scriptures say that Elijah has to come back before the Mashiach, before the Messiah comes? And Christ's response is, Elijah has already come back and they didn't recognize him. And Matthew adds in parentheses, here Jesus was talking about John the Baptist. So we have Jesus pointing out that John the Baptist was the reincarnation of Elijah. Now there's another story, I think it's about John chapter 9, where Jesus and his disciples are coming out of the city of Jericho, and they're walking out, and there's a blind beggar sitting at the gates, a guy who's been born blind. And the disciples look at him and they say to Jesus, whose fault was it that he was born blind? Was it his own fault, or was it his parents' fault? Now that question doesn't make any sense. How could somebody be born blind for their own sin? Unless there was a previous incarnation. Now this is karmic kind of payback in some senses. So you have this very strong notion. Christ will say, unless a man is born again of water and the Spirit, he will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So Christ is very strong on reincarnation. Now in 553 AD, the Christian churches got rid of it. And it was courtesy of the empress at the time. I think she was called Theodora was her name. And she'd been born in a very lowly estate and had worked her way up and was married by the emperor. Now she's the empress of the Byzantine Empire. And there's no way she's going to agree to reincarnation. She's not going to come back and risk being a kind of a slave girl in a future incarnation. So she prevails upon her husband, who's calling the council, I think it was the Second Council of Constantinople, to outlaw the notion of reincarnation. And it gets thrown out. So for the first 553 years, it's accepted. Now it continues to sneak into Catholic theology in the guise of what's called purgatory. So purgatory is a disincarnate place in which we continue to refine the soul. So when you die as a Catholic, you're going to go to one of two places, one of three places. You go to heaven, if you've been guiltless, and you met a priest just before you died and he shrived you and you got rid of all your sins, you go straight to heaven. If you die with a sin on your soul, like you just ate meat and it was a Friday, you're going down. Or it's a Sunday and you didn't go to Mass, you're going down. But there's another place, if you weren't that bad, but you weren't that good, there's a place in between where we'll burn you for 40,000 years to refine you, to get rid of all the kind of the bad stuff. And that's called purgatory. So what does it mean? It means some kind of a disincarnate, kind of a refining factory before you're fit for heaven. So that's in some senses the Catholic version that survived of reincarnation. Some place where you continue to refine your soul until you're good enough to get to nirvana.
Okay. You don't believe Jesus was a Christian and he didn't come to found a new religion. So who was he and what was his purpose?
Yeah. I actually believe that Jesus reincarnated many times. I believe that Jesus was a reincarnation of the Buddha, that the same figure who appeared in 550 BCE in India appeared in Israel, 2,000 years ago. And so in some senses, I think in the course of the evolution of human life, that having decided to experience 3D density as human beings and forgetting who we really are, periodically there are great avatars and great souls who come among us to kind of unstick the stuck wheels of human evolution. And I think that there was a group came in at that stage. I think it was a cohort group, because I think great avatars always come in a group. So I think there's a group of 4 souls that came in at that stage. The first one was Jesus, who was bringing in a Christ consciousness. And just a few nights ago, I got a download about that. I asked, what is Christ consciousness? And the message I got in the dream was, Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of everything that exists. That's Christ consciousness. So to be Christ conscious, or to have Buddha nature, or to be enlightened or self-realized, is to live in a space of the realization constantly that everything I see, I look out my window, I'm looking at trees. There's a bunny rabbit on the hill up there I can see right now. That's a divine articulation. So Christ consciousness is that permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all that is. So here Christ came to bring that. His mother came to bring what I call Christa consciousness. What does the feminine version of that look like? And then the court consisted of Jesus, his mother, Mary of Magdala, and I think John, the beloved disciple. So these were 4 great souls who came in again to try to unstick the stuck wheels of the human evolutionary trajectory. I think he may have come back since. I think perhaps Francis of Assisi may have been a further incarnation of Jesus. I think that more importantly than reincarnating as a specific human individual, I think that Jesus may incarnate, as a movement of Christ consciousness, not in a specific personality, but in fact as a kind of a tendency in the human family to move back into love and to move back into compassion for all that exists. So I think he's among us again. I think the Buddha is among us again. I think these great sages are among us again. But they're among us not so much as individual kind of avatars as much as they are by movements of the spirit.
Fascinating. I mean, truly fascinating. I wish we had more time to go deeper and further, but perhaps you'll come back.
I would love to come back, Sandie. It's a pleasure.
I have so many more questions.
And I'm Irish. I'll talk at the drop of a hat.
Of course you will. Of course you will. Yeah. Well, we're out of time now, Sean. Thank you so much for joining us today. And my goodness, yeah. If you want a good read, if you really want a good read, yeah, you've got to read Setting God Free. It's quite a book. Sean, thank you.
Big hug to you.
You too. You too. Okay, we'll make another date. Okay, Father SeanOLaoire. You can find out more about his work, his book, his events, blog posts, and homilies at the website spiritsinSpacesuits.com. That's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of What Is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thanks again to Father SeanOLaoire.